those of us who are part of the Anshe Emet Synagogue and the Bright Star Church are no stranger to the kind of dialogue that Heschel and King created. I'm proud of the conversations and the work that I've been privileged to engage with Pastor Harris. I'm very proud of the relationship of our communities. And one of the blessings of that dialogue, one of the blessings of that relationship, is the connection that was created in a book group that was formed last year during this very same Dr. Martin Luther King weekend. And during the course of this year, this group has brought together representatives of both communities. They began by talking about Jonathan Ives' wonderful book, King, A Life. This morning, I'm honored to sit with two of the group leaders, Jen Tescher and Carol Jones, who we better know as CJ. I have such profound respect for the work that you do. Jen is founder and CEO at Financial Health Network, and CJ is the Chief External Officer at Bright Star Community Outreach, and it's my privilege to work with CJ on the important work of Bright Star as a board member. We thank you for making time on this chilly morning to be with us here. You bring so much warmth and so much wisdom to our community this morning. Make sure your microphones are on. So let's get to it. Let's talk about the book group and your experience. You know, when we study text, it allows us a forum for deeper discussion. So Jen, what was your experience of reading excerpts of your husband's book with the group?
Well, before I answer, I just want to acknowledge that our friend Annette Barnes is also here from Bright Star Church, and she's been really instrumental in helping to organize. So it's nice to see you, Annette. Thanks for being here. I am very fortunate to get to read many drafts and versions of Jonathan's book during the course of their creation. But it was another thing entirely to have the opportunity to read and discuss those chapters with CJ and Annette and other people from the church and from our own community. And, you know, it started even before we got the book group together. So CJ and Annette and I got on the phone, and I was just so amazed because within minutes they started sharing their own personal stories of their experience with racism and with civil rights. CJ talked about her experience meeting Dr. King, and you know, it's rare in today's society to so quickly be able to create an environment in which you feel comfortable and trusted to share your own truth and to know that it will be heard. And so from that moment, I knew that there was going to be something really special.
You know, I'm reminded as you were speaking, that Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the United States of America. And so for people of color and for Jews to actually sit down and have a conversation is sadly a rarity. I remember people coming back from that first session to Anshe Emet and saying, you know, there were people at that meeting that were marching with Dr. King. And that was profound. What was that like for you to be sitting with people who were sharing that experience?
It brought it to life in a way that sometimes history can feel old. And certainly the whole point of Jonathan's book is to make King anew to us again. and for us to remember him as the radical that he was, but to sit in community with people who were there in the moment and are willing to talk and share about that experience is really just an incredible blessing. I felt really, just really privileged, frankly, to be able to experience that, and again, for them to feel like they could trust us with their stories.
Yeah. You know, it's as if we walk with our history. Jews are used to meeting people who were survivors, or people who may have been in the Six-Day War. But we don't get to meet people who are wearing their own history and have a chance to examine that experience. CJ, you also read Dara Horn's book, The World Loves Dead Jews, which, to say that the book is edgy would be an understatement. What was your reaction? What was the reaction of the group, folks at Bright Star, in reading a book like that?
So before I start, let me just say that the whole experience was that we were going to do it was very good. In our community with Pastor Chris Harris, who is my pastor, we have this thing called voluntold. It means that he comes to you and says, you're going to do it, and you say, yes, sir, I volunteer. So in that meeting, my pastor said, I think this is a good idea. And then my assistant pastor, Rabbi Siegel, said, I think this is a wonderful idea. And so we got together and we began to decide what was this all going to look like. And in the first book, it was easier for me because I had lived a lot of it. In the second book, it was a bit different. But we had reached a point where we had become a community, if you will, crossing cultures and coming to a place where we felt safe to ask questions and not feel that we were being intrusive or that we were asking something dumb. So we could say, well, I remember saying, well, wait, what about the name changes? What was that all about? And to be, I had always been told that the people who brought them in at Ellis Island were just lazy and made up names for them that were more Americanized. But to be shared and with the group saying, no, that wasn't the reason. So it was a place where I could learn things that really brought together our differences and our similarities.
Well, and I just have to say, there were people in that room who were learning that same fact. People from the Anshe Emet community were learning that same fact for the first time, because that's very much a belief of many people in the Jewish community that people, they couldn't spell the complicated names as opposed to Jews choosing to change their name to protect themselves.
Exactly. And then that's what we asked. Well, why would you choose your name? And again, for protection, something that we as an African community absolutely understood.
Right, but one of the differences is that a Jew may show white and change their name to attempt to fit in, to assimilate, which is not a privilege that people of color have. So it's a very interesting dynamic there that I just want to underscore.
Yeah, which while my mother was white, it's hard for me to convince someone that I'm white. So that's absolutely the case.
Right,
yeah.
You also read The Life of Malcolm X. Tell us how that was received by the group after having read King a Life.
I think with King, as well as with Malcolm X, there were a lot of questions being asked to clarify. Probably one of the biggest things that we talked about with King and Malcolm X is how they were perceived in the community, with King being one of the good guys and Malcolm X being not so good. And so how did we develop that, and how did we feel about that? And one of the things that we talked about is that King, as his life began to end, as he had been threatened by Hoover to disclose his secrets about adultery, was beginning to come a little more edgier. And then when you look at Malcolm X, who in the end began to look towards peace, we wondered, what would it have been like had these two got together and been able to live a life? So that was one of the things that what else would you say?
Yeah, that's what really stood out to me was the connection between the two men, and if they only met briefly.
There's question about that, if they ever really met. They were in the same room together.
Right.
In the same meeting together, but some say they met and some say they didn't.
Right. Well, and Jonathan's scholarship sort of has demonstrated that things that it was purported that King and Malcolm X said about each other were
Right.
actually taken out of context
Right.
and doctored, and that Martin Luther King understood that in a way Malcolm X was enabling him because he was serving as his foil, and Malcolm X understood that as well.
Yeah. And for me, having lived that, it was difficult. It was believing in King and peace, and then it was being a young black woman who's saying, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of being ignored. I'm tired of being disrespected. And maybe what I want is something closer to what Malcolm X is speaking. So as a young adult, I walked this kind of, who am I? Thank goodness, and with praying parents who were ministers, I ended up somewhere in the middle. But those two books brought back to me the suffering, brought back to me remembering that I had once marched in the South, brought back to me the March on Washington, and brought back to me that things hadn't really changed then as opposed to now.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah.
And I know that the Anshe Emet community really wanted to know from folks in your community, do you feel like it's better? Do you feel like there's been change? Where is it not better? So it's, to your point earlier, the text really allows for to almost depersonalize it in order to get more personal and proximate. You know, Brian Stevenson is one of my heroes, and he talks a lot about the importance of being proximate. And that, for me, is one of the motivations for also being voluntold. In part because I was complaining to the rabbi. So you never complain without then getting voluntold back. But I was so struck a year ago when you brought like a massive busload of people here. You must have had 70 or 80 people here from the church. And we had that lovely dinner after the service. We all sat together. And I said, we don't go down to the church. Like, have we been down there yet? And I think the rabbi was like, well, what are you going to do about that? And so for me, I think the relationship between the two communities and the two institutions and the two leaders of those institutions is so inspiring. And I also think that in the Jewish community, it's often our first instinct to want to help right? To want to repair the world, tikkun olam. But I think particularly post the murder of George Floyd, I've really had a deep desire to want to build community, and that's different, and it's hard to do. And so I just feel so grateful that we were both asked
Yes.
by our institutional leaders
Yes.
to come together.
Yes.
So, CJ, what would you say? I just want to make one comment about what you were just talking about, because, and I think Jonathan makes this point in the book very beautifully. America likes the "I have a dream," Dr. King. America likes the passive resistance, Dr. King. They don't like the angry
Right.
Malcolm X.
Right.
And so we like to put one up, on the shelf, and the other one we want to put on the trash heap of history.
Exactly.
And suddenly you realize that you are saying that people can't be angry,
Right.
and be heard. And so Dr. King actually kind of walked that and balanced that in a very, very interesting way. So CJ, what would you say that you have learned about Jews that you didn't know a year ago? I'll ask you the same question, John.
So let me start by saying that I grew up in a mixed community in Los Angeles. And in our community, there were Japanese Americans. The next highest population were Jews, and then blacks. So kids running in and out of the house. We had kosher cookies in each one of the houses, so when we were running in for snacks, their kids could get their snacks. Many a time we had to bury a plate, but that was a whole nother story. And so I think that I did know a little bit about the community. I think that what struck me was that there were so many more similarities with our community and how we deal with things and how we've dealt with tragedy and oppression that made me think that we were much closer, we could be a much closer community than I thought. Yeah. And one kind of silly thing, we were talking about the way we look. And we were talking about, as African Americans, how the wide nose, the thick lips, it was all something to just feel badly about, because society said that that wasn't pretty. And there was someone in the group who said, well, yeah, but at 17, your birthday present was a nose job. And that, our community said, wow, we didn't think that you had problems with the way that you looked. So it was the simple things and the important things. It was how we have dealt with what America has done to us that I think really helped me understand and appreciate and love the Jewish community more than I thought that I did.
Jen, what do you think you learned about the Black community over the course of the year? Or you might also share comments of the group.
Yeah. I think one of the things that many of us have been most struck by was something, I think it was Annette, you've said it many times. The Bright Star community is envious of the way Jews teach their history to their children, and that long sense of history. And I didn't even understand that idea at the beginning. Like, what do you mean? You talk about your history, but their history is so much shorter
Right.
because they can't really trace back, very few can trace back previous to their
Exactly.
enslavement and being brought to this country. And the other thing that, that I hadn't really appreciated was the shame that many in the Black community feel of having been part of that enslavement, that experience, and how those two things combined, correct me if I'm wrong, leave them without a real sense of history and pride that they can teach to their children in generation to generation. And that's such a prominent feature of Judaism and the Jewish community. And that's something that we've talked about quite a bit.
Yeah. Because when we came over in the slave boats, it was intentional to separate. So people from villages were separated so that you couldn't understand each other and you were pitted against each other. So as a result, we didn't have the history because there was no one who could tell us that from our particular villages. So very few did have that.
So coming back to this Shabbat morning, it's of interest that the story that we read of Moses and Pharaoh and the going out from Egypt is seminal for Jews. It's because what we're always reminded of is that whoever the tyrant is, redemption is a possibility.
Yeah.
It's noteworthy that in the early days of this country, under the whip of slaves, when the slaves or when people of color were missionized, they were given Bibles that were heavily edited. And in the Bibles that they received, these stories from the book of Exodus were missing. They tore that away as well. And so how powerful it is that we can share this
Right.
and come to a deeper understanding of each other. And speaking of that, I want to note that tomorrow you're going to be meeting at Bright Star Church.
Yes.
And if you are interested in being part of this group, I'm going to give you a chance to talk about the book in a moment. But I do want to say that I have a feeling that the conversation will also touch on October 7th.
Yes.
Because the Jewish community is feeling very alone. And I want to note that of all the pastors that I know, the only one that reached out to me after October 7th was Pastor Harris. And so the sense of loneliness is somewhat ameliorated because of our relationship with Bright Star Church, and I have a sense that that will come up as part of your conversation as well. But why don't you tell us about the book that you're reading, and if you've read the book and you want to be part of this, I want to encourage you to become part of this very special book group.
Oh, you're leading next. You're
I
leading
am?
tomorrow, yeah, so you can start.
Yeah, I will also just say that one of the things about the book club that's also been so special is that we trade off locations.
Yeah.
So every other time we're either here or we're down at the
South side.
church. And I think that's also very important, being part of each other's physical
Yeah.
communities as well. So we decided to go with something a little lighter, some fiction.
Something
Everything we had
fiction.
read until now was nonfiction. And we read The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, which is a very popular book.
Right.
And on the way in to the synagogue, I said, I don't know about this book. And she says, yeah, I didn't really like it either. So we haven't actually talked about the book
Right.
with each other yet. But I think it'll be a very interesting conversation.
Right.
And the author of the book is biracial.
Yes.
His mother was white. He's a black man. And one of his earliest books was a memoir of his mother
Right.
called The Color of Water, which is how I got to know him in the first place, James McBride. He's an amazing writer. This book is written in a very Yiddishy kind of style. So it's, a gazillion characters and a
Yes.
meandering way before you actually
On
get
and
to the
on.
actual story, which is not my favorite.
Yeah.
But what he does is talk about the connection between the Jewish and Black communities in, where is it, outside?
Actually, I lived in Reading, Pennsylvania, and Pottsville is right next to it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it was an interesting relationship between
Yes.
those two communities at the time, fictionally, and so there'll be a lot to talk about.
Yes.
We want to take this opportunity to thank you for making this Martin Luther King weekend more hopeful, because it is the kinds of dialogues, the relationships that you have created, that Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel created, that are going to move us forward. And we know and leave this meeting, this service today, with a deeper sense of hope. But we are grateful to the two of you, and we thank you for being with us and for all the work you've put into this book group. It is really, what we would say, a holy effort, and we thank you.
Thank you.